he was part of the research that concluded that marijuana was something you smoke, you laugh, it kind of relaxes you and makes you more likely that you'll speak easier. The disparity, the contradiction between the public, the disparity between the public statements by Harry Anslinger describing cannabis as this murderous drug and what they knew to be the case privately, a drug that relaxes you and makes you laugh and makes you talk, is so glaring that that's sort of the first story I want to tell about Anslinger. That what do we know? What can we conclude from this? That what officials say publicly about drugs doesn't correspond to what privately they know to be the truth about it. Second point involving Harry Anslinger. When he was head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the United States, lasted a long time, from the 30s through the early 60s. But during this period, when the CIA got involved with their mind control research, heavily in the early 1950s, at that time, there was a story going around about heroin, where Harry Anslinger was testifying before Congress and saying that the communist Chinese were responsible for pumping heroin into the United States. This is what he was, again, saying publicly. Privately, what he was doing, this is part of the anti-communist witch hunt hysteria in the early 1950s. Privately, he was supplying Senator Joe McCarthy, the famous anti-communist from those days, with a script of morphine, because McCarthy became a morphine addict. And it was Anslinger supplying him with the drugs. So not only do they lie about drugs, but they lie about what they do. They lie about where they're coming from, because allegedly, this was all part of a communist plot, the heroin coming into the United States, when they really knew that he was supplying. And they knew this was a bogus story anyway about the communist Chinese. Okay. Third story involving Anslinger. At a point very early on in the CIA's drug programs, in the early 50s, they had an operation where they were testing the drugs on unwitting American citizens. I'll kind of recapitulate how it got to this point, later on. But what they were doing, in essence, they were testing LSD on unwitting American citizens. And the way they do this, they were working with prostitutes in New York initially, and then later in the Bay Area, San Francisco, where prostitutes who sometimes were drug addicts themselves, they were promised by a high-level narcotics agent named George White that they wouldn't be busted if they would do this thing with the CIA, or they weren't told necessarily it was the CIA, but the idea was to bring their customers back to a safe house, a CIA safe house in New York City that was set up to look like it was a whorehouse, a bordello. And there were two-way mirrors, and CIA agents would sit behind these mirrors and watch the prostitutes spike the drinks of the customers they would bring back with LSD and other drugs, and then watch what would happen. They would record. And they were doing this not only to test drugs, but they were testing sexpionage techniques. They were trying to figure out what's the best time to try to get information with a person if you've got an agent sleeping with someone you want to get information from. Is it better just before sex, just after, things like this? This is also what they were testing in the safe houses, not just drugs. But Harry Anslinger was played an important role in these experiments because he lent one of his top narcotics agents, George Hunter White, to the CIA to do this research, and he knew about it. Again, he was privy to it. So here you have a situation where the CIA was actually dispensing drugs to people through a narcotics agent whose job ostensibly was to prevent the circulation of drugs. So it's not only that they lie about the effects of the drugs, they lie about where they're coming from, but the third point here is that national security, so-called, always trumps drug control. So when the two priorities conflict, it's the national security priority that takes precedence over the priority of drug control, and that the DEA, and the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States, formed later on, is a successor to Harry Anslinger's organization. When it comes to, kind of looking the other way when the CIA is involved with organizations that are dealing drugs, if they're organizations friendly to the CIA, if they're organizations that the CIA wants to use to overthrow a government or something like that, they're very happy to look the other way, that it seems that it's okay as long as you're snorting the anti-communist line, to do what you're doing. So that's sort of a way of starting here. Was someone had their hand raised before? Because as people have filtered in, I'm going to encourage people to ask questions at any time so we could talk more among each other than me just going on and on and on. Because I have 2 more talks today, so I'm not going on. Please. And I'll be repeating the question, and hopefully you can ask in English.
What are the sources of your information?
Specifically about, the question was, what are the sources of my information? And was there some specific statement I made that you want the information to, or in general?
In general.
In general, okay. When I researched acid dreams, I went through close to 20,000 pages of one's classified documents, mainly from the CIA, also from the U.S. Army, the Air Force, the Navy, Food and Drug Administration, Department of Agriculture, a whole bunch of different government agencies. I was able to access documents. And then I did a lot of interviews. But again, the CIA part of the story is only a little part of acid dreams. It's mainly a social history of the counterculture, or the use of LSD, in that context. So of course, there's a lot of written material about that, and I did a lot of interviews. So the combination of interviews and documents, primarily archive research, so forth. Please.
When are these documents, or when were they declassified? Is there a time period where they say going after a certain point, 30 years ago, they're then open to the public?
The question is about when the documents were declassified and what they cover, what period. There was, in the United States, some scandals involving the CIA that came to light in the middle of the 1970s after Watergate, or kind of connected with Watergate, because there was a CIA role in Watergate that was never really clear what it was. But the Congress in the United States began to investigate certain aspects of what the CIA was doing, in particular, the illegal spying program on Americans. The CIA is supposed to be focused on people abroad, but it was engaged in spying against anti-war activists in the United States, at home or in the United States, and that was not proper. So that was one focus of the investigations, and it led into the LSD program and some of the drug testing that the CIA was doing. Congress never did a real full-fledged investigation. It was very limited. But during that period, documents began to be released. There was a researcher named John Marks who had worked for the State Department at one time. It was his request that pried loose a lot of documents, about 10,000 pages of documents, mainly pertaining to the MKUltra program. Now, these documents are not a complete record, because what we got, first of all, is no documents that really deal with operational uses or operation. That's not, see, at that time, they had a Freedom of Information Act that actually was somewhat effective in getting documents in the United States. Now it's very difficult. Using the Freedom of Information Act, particularly with the CIA, is like pulling teeth. You just don't get anything these days. The military services are a little better. They always were in terms of this. But that's how the documents were coming out. And the CIA documents mainly covered the period from 47, when the CIA was first formed, through early mid-60s, through the beginnings of the successor program to MKUltra, which was called MK Search. And really, after the mid-60s, the documents dropped off. And what we had found out at the time, when the CIA was releasing this material, that there was about 20 times more material than they had released, that could have been released, which they were withholding. So there was a lot more, and you have to, again, you don't get the whole story here. You have to put it together. And the way they released it was almost purposely confusing, because you go through so many hundreds of pages of mishmash that were meaningless, and then you find one document that was a gem, So it was took some time to put it together. Please. I'm sorry.
Rumor about the CIA was involved with bringing in drugs into the black urban inner city.
Okay, the question was about the CIA. Okay, thank you. The question was about the CIA, or the rumor about the CIA being involved in facilitating the flow of drugs into the inner cities in the United States, the black and brown ghettos and so forth. It's a little bit different from what we're focusing on, although the end of the story, there are some indication that the CIA may have been working with some people involved in black market distribution of LSD. But generally, my take on this is a little bit nuanced, in that I don't think, I can't imagine a situation where CIA agents are sitting in a room and they're thinking, okay, and they come up with this idea, let's do this, let's really screw up, the target populations in the United States. I don't think that that's really what's going on here. I think what happens is they have a particular foreign policy objective that they are given a mandate to fulfill, but using whatever means necessary, illegal, legal. There's a war in Central America. They want to topple the government. Nicaragua, they're going to work with the people who are anti-communist. These people are involved with drug dealing. That's okay with the CIA as long as they're going to topple that government. I don't think the CIA says we prefer to work with drug dealers. I just don't think they care if they do, because you have a long history of this sort of thing going back many years in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, the heroin trafficking. Again, but generally speaking, my sense of it is it's not that the first priority is bring drugs into the United States. That's almost like collateral damage. The first priority is to win the war in Vietnam or win the war in Central America, or so forth and so on. Now, you do hear stories that maybe call into question this paradigm, but generally speaking, that's how I tend to look at these things. You had a question.
When Richard Helms left the CIA, he destroyed a lot of the documents you're talking about. Is that related to the 20 crimes that's been undiscovered or unreleased?
The question was about Richard Helms, who had been the head of the CIA. And when he left in the early, mid-1970s, he ordered many documents destroyed pertaining to MKUltra and other projects. And was this related to the 20 times more documents that were still there? Well, yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that they still existed, these documents. These were documents that weren't destroyed. A lot of times they pertain to financial records and so forth. Again, generally it's not operational material that you're going to get through the Freedom of Information Act. The CIA has an exemption there. So there's a lot of material that wasn't destroyed that probably had to do with after Helms left. These programs are ongoing. It's not like the CIA stopped being interested in drugs after they finished with LSD. They're interested in this stuff today. They're looking at, how to modify neurotransmitters, serotonin, things that will affect the body in very subtle ways. I fear that they will look at the endocannabinoid system and figure out how to use that to their own advantage. Anything that's going on in psychopharmacology, the CIA will be monitoring and tracking. They will be interested in that. They consider that part of their responsibility. I just want to keep switching around. I'll get to everybody, I promise.
How did you get involved in this? How long ago? What were the things that took the skill to do?
The question was how I got involved with it. Okay, I'll make this quick. I was based in Washington, D.C. briefly, and then mid-late 70s. I was with a group, a public interest group, a nonprofit group that was working with Congress. At the time was reinvestigating the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And we were serving as sort of unofficial advisors to this investigation. And as part of that, because we knew that the CIA had worked with organized crime, worked with the mafia in trying to kill Castro. And that was seen as somehow important in understanding what happened with Kennedy, and what happened with the Kennedy assassination. Not that Castro decided when he found out about this that he wanted to kill Kennedy, but that because the same elements seemed to be coming up in terms of the characters around the Kennedy assassination. CIA, organized crime, et cetera, et cetera. The same elements seemed to percolate there. And in the drug and mind control programs, with the Office of Security, which was the first unit that got involved with the CIA, Colonel Sheffield Edwards was the head of that office in the early 1950s. In the late 1950s, he becomes a very important character in terms of putting the CIA together with the mafia for the hits against Castro. So because of that, we thought, well, we should go back and look at all these, as much as we can, of these programs if it would shed any light on the Kennedy assassination, or, in this area. And very quickly, I lost interest in the Kennedy assassination because the story took on such an intrigue for me personally, because there was one document that I came across early on that described a purchase that the CIA wanted to make from Sandoz of a quantity of LSD that was enormous, that they described in the documents. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was enough to turn on millions of people. And that was the first type of LSD I ever took, was from Sandoz. It was circulating on the black market. And I thought to myself, oh my God, did did I get my first LSD because of this CIA purchase or something like that? What did they do with all this stuff, you know? And it turns out they got the decimal point wrong. So it wasn't 1 gram or whatever it was, a kilogram of LSD, but it was much, much less than was actually available, and they proceeded to purchase it. And then they had a drug company, Eli Lilly, actually develop LSD, create it for themselves. So I'm just going to keep switching back and forth. Rob.
Martin, I've wondered about this for a long time. Just how smart is the CIA, and were they aware, for example, that LSD and other psychedelic experiences can radically change one's worldview, and that if this got out or was ever legitimized in the university, that there could be a major transformation of consciousness, which would then be a threat to national security? Can you imagine guys
yeah.
sitting around in a room saying, well, you know, we gave this to an agent, and somehow after that he wasn't so nationalistic, he became kind of a global citizen, and you can't have this?
It's a good question. I don't know if I can repeat all of it, but the essence of it is, how smart is the CIA? Did they have any sense, intuition, recognition that LSD could have a very positive impact on a person and maybe change their worldview in a way that would make them more inclined to, affirm the values of peace and brotherhood and sisterhood, human cooperation, this kind of thing? That might pose a threat ultimately to a kind of a nationalistic agenda that the CIA was pursuing on behalf of the U.S. government. In essence, was that what you're saying? Yeah. I don't think the CIA understood what they were dealing with. I think that they interpreted their own experiences in a way that you can maybe understand, why they would make this error. But because their experiences were very paranoid, they're living in this world of the communists are out to get you, and they're the ones who are, the front line, and they got to do this, or the United States is going to be swallowed up by the red tide, the dominoes, everything, and this is the world they're living in, and they have LSD and they take it, and you look at it and is he a communist? Is he a communist? This is going to make you very paranoid because LSD tends to magnify your perspective. And they ended up then defining it as this paranoia-inducing agent. They thought, oh, that's what this drug is. You take this drug and you become paranoid. If you give the drug to somebody, they will become paranoid. And because that's the kind of experiences they were having, they tended to project those properties onto the drug. I think maybe people in the 60s made a similar mistake in some ways, projecting other properties onto the drug. But certainly the CIA misunderstood, in my opinion, LSD, or certainly understood it from a very narrow perspective. And because they had what's interesting, let me backtrack. It's a big question you asked, Rob. It's a good one. But in essence, I don't think the CIA planned for LSD to get out on the streets. I don't think that they wanted that to happen. I don't think they ever anticipated it could happen. They figured, here was this thing that was, it made you freak out. It was a threat to national security. They couldn't imagine anyone who would want to do this. It wasn't like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like that sort of thing. Generally speaking. And so I think that what happened in the 60s would come as a great surprise to the CIA. That said, they knew a lot about the drug, and they would be very interested in what was going on in the 60s. And the question is, even if they weren't necessarily responsible for this happening, at least certainly not directly or not willfully. Well, I think they purposely got that one wrong. They were told to get that wrong. But these were the days where the CIA, at least the analysts, were more true to what they should have been doing and providing, just sort of raw information before, with Reagan, they were told to provide the information, irrespective of what it was. So if you get what I'm saying, they kind of played the. All right, but let me just say one more thing in terms of what Rob's question is. Actually, maybe take another question and we'll get back to that.
Can you comment over here on this side
Okay.
about Mary Pinchot Meyer and her relationship with John F. Kennedy? Just kind of a little past question, and the mysterious things around her death. And do you think it's really true that there are filtration systems on the internet and on cell phones where certain key words are being filtered out at some You probably know what the name of this, what they think like this, big brother system is. Do you think this is really happening?
Oh, in terms of a lot of things, sure it's happening, but it's one of these things, they get so much information, it takes them years to wade through it afterwards. So it's like, the problem isn't a lack of information in the society, it's too much, and I think the CIA and the FBI deal with that problem as well. But in terms of Mary Pinchot Meyer, let me explain who she is. She was one of President Kennedy's girlfriends. And not just a fling, they had an ongoing relationship, they were part of similar social circles. This was a serious ongoing relationship they had. And according to Timothy Leary, Mary Pinchot Meyer was coming to visit Leary and learning how to use LSD. This is when he was at Harvard, and she was very interested in that. Mary Meyer was married to a CIA agent named Cord Meyer. He was pretty high up in the CIA. He did a lot of work in Europe, actually. And she died a very mysterious death. It's never been fully explained after Kennedy was killed. She was jogging in a park in Washington, D.C., and she was murdered. It's possible that she was just murdered. I don't rule that out. I don't know what happened, but there's a lot of speculation that she may have been murdered to silence her. Curious things happened that her diary ended up missing after she died. James Angleton, who was head of the CIA counterintelligence, another unit in the CIA, which was experimenting with LSD, which was working with LSD. So a lot of questions about that. I couldn't say for sure. But one quick little story I will tell you. Lee Harvey Oswald was very interested in LSD, and he was reading Aldous Huxley shortly before the Kennedy assassination. He was checking out Huxley's books in the library. He no doubt had heard about what happened at Harvard with Timothy Leary when he was expelled from Harvard in May of 1963, because in July of 1963, Oswald walked into the New Orleans district attorney's office, and he started questioning an assistant district attorney about this drug he had read about in a book by Huxley. And I have these documents from the FBI that all lay this out. And he talked about Huxley's book. He said, This Great World was how the FBI, they talk about a Freudian slip. They called it This Great World rather than Brave New World. And Oswald was singing the praises of these drugs that he wanted to get access to, and he wondered how he could get access to them. He was going into the office there in New Orleans to do this. So he was very interested in psychedelic drugs. And his unit, when he was in the Marines in Japan, was tested, was one of the groups that the CIA was using to test drugs. So he may have had the experience even in the Army. It's hard to know. But he was definitely interested.
Excuse me, could we sort of group questions to a certain theme? Because
Would that...
I would really be interested to sort of look into the questions that were asked before about...
Okay, why don't you do that? Or,
because otherwise it's just sort of...
yeah.
A follow-up.
The comment was just sort of a little bit too, that if you have a question that relates to the question someone asks, I mean, the other thing that there is a story to be told here. I mean, if you prefer, I can kind of work it through and really kind of tell the story more in detail. Maybe I should do that a little while, try that for a little while, and then we can come back. If you really, really feel compelled for the question, ask. But I'll give enough time so we have a lot of time for questions.
I have a follow-up for you.
Okay.
About the CIA, and did they know what they were doing in the 60s? They obviously, to me, and like you pointed out, didn't quite, or were pretty narrow about it. But the interesting thing becomes then, when did they, if ever, catch on to what they were doing? And how was the impact of that? What did they think? The same meeting, but 3 years later, or something like that,
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite understand the question.
Did they ever catch on to the changes of positive kind they were working in the youth culture and the pacifism? And do they know now? And how do they relate to that?
The question was how they relate to the youth culture. Did they ever understood? I understand that was sort of a positive thing in some ways. And I don't think that's how the CIA viewed it. I think they said, these people are crazy. This drug makes you crazy. We know it. We experimented with it. We found it out. If a lot of people take it, it's going to make them crazy too. But let me kind of backtrack and I'll segue into that. I mentioned the OSS experiments with marijuana. And there's some delightful descriptions of actual interrogations where they used cannabis, where they would kind of make a kind of like, sort of like a version of hash oil almost, except it was clear, and they would inject it into a tobacco cigarette So it would seem it was just you're smoking a cigarette, and the person smokes, and they get high, and they start talking a lot. The problem for the OSS, the CIA's forerunner, this didn't always work. Sometimes people kind of got paranoid when they smoked, and it didn't produce the kind of results they wanted. The CIA wants predictability. They want certainty. They want to know if they give a person a truth drug, they'll get the truth. And even though marijuana was the best available substance as far as they were concerned, it didn't fit the bill. So the CIA, when it was formed after World War II, picked up where the OSS left off, and they start looking at a variety of different techniques. They call them special interrogation techniques, which meant literally any time you would interrogate a person using some technique other than just questions, other than just verbal manipulation. So drugs were part of the special interrogation techniques. And they developed two techniques by the late 1940s that they were using for special interrogations. One involved giving a kind of a barbiturate in combination with hypnosis, narco-hypnosis. Sometimes they use the drug to kind of make it easier to hypnotize a person and then try to hypnotize a person and get information. Sometimes it worked. Then they used a combination of drugs, where they would literally have an IV, intravenous, injected into both arms. One was a barbiturate, a downer, and the other is an amphetamine, an upper. So what they would do, first they'd turn on the barbiturate, and they'd bring a person into a sleep state. And then they would flick the switch and have the amphetamine go, and they would bring a person just slightly out of the sleep state, not fully awake, but in this kind of intermediate groggy state. They were just sort of coming to, and the CIA documents refer to this as the twilight zone, the talking zone. They try to keep a person in this limbo for as long as possible and question them. And you could imagine this is not a very exact science, and sometimes they were using ridiculous amounts of drugs, 7 different drugs. The documents describe people puking and all. It just anyway. Neither of these special interrogation techniques, which they were using in the late 1940s, again provided the surefire results. And so when they first got their hands on LSD, and the earliest moment. From the CIA documents, it could have been earlier, but the documents have it begin in 1951. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for a truth drug. And LSD was, unlike anything else they had come across, and their encounter with LSD is very interesting because the documents that describe their initial encounter with LSD, the initial work, are so exciting. They think they're like kids with a new toy. They think this is it. They finally have found this holy grail of the intelligence trade that's going to change everything, that's really going to give them this surefire interrogation technique. And they found that people couldn't even remember very well on LSD, so it's perfect. A person spills the beans and they don't remember. I mean, that's ideal, because there's always a problem once you interrogate someone. What do you do with them afterwards? The disposal problem, they refer to it. They tried to deal with that through lobotomies sometimes. So there's this initial excitement with LSD that then gives way to a period of confusion. Because they're finding that, okay, they give a person acid, sometimes they're getting them to talk. Other times, these people are reporting, these experiences where they're defying the interrogator because they feel like they're God in heaven. And they're just laughing, and they think it's trivial what the CIA, and they seem to be almost immune to interrogation because they're so blissed out, And sometimes they're so freaked out they can't even utter a word. They're just shaking in horror, So they're finding that the experience is not always so positive for interrogation purposes. But the difference here is that when the CIA would try a drug, and then it didn't quite work, they would, move on and try something else. With LSD, they didn't move on to something else. They went, all right, wait a minute. If this isn't the perfect truth drug as we envisioned or we had hoped for initially, or as initially we thought it was, and there's this one document here, CIA and potential new agent for unconventional warfare from '54. This is how they were referring to LSD. This is a cover of a big, big document. Okay, if it doesn't work quite the way we thought it would, what can it do for us? What can we use LSD for? Because this was something so amazing. You all heard the panorama, right? It was odorless, colorless, tasteless, etc. They knew they had something that was really powerful. If they could just figure out what to do with it, they intuited that this could be put to good use, even though it wasn't your classic truth drug thing. You give a person a drug and they spill the beans. So it goes for about 18 months. The CIA is really grappling with this. What is this thing? So somebody proposes, well, it's not a truth serum, but what it is, it's like a lie serum. That it will make, because you get so confused and you get so freaked out, you can babble gibberish, that maybe it should be used to prevent a CIA agent from giving accurate information to the enemy. The idea was, if you equip a person who's going to be sent on a sensitive mission overseas with LSD, and a tiny little tablet, they can somehow pop a tab of acid before the interrogation or once they've been captured, and they'll be guaranteed to give the enemy useless information. So from a truth serum, it went 180 degrees to a lie serum, and it shows just how confused the CIA was. And so, but they realized that one way or another, if they were going to use the drug for espionage purposes, in all likelihood, it's going to mean that they were going to give it to people without them knowing. It would be surreptitious uses. So another thought that the CIA had was that if you had a CIA agent falling into the hands of the enemy, and they were dosed with LSD, the CIA agent was, this could be really bad news. So what you needed to do was familiarize the CIA agent with LSD as part of their training. So there was one document I came across from November 1953. It was called a meeting of the project committee. It had representatives from like 5 or 6 different units in the CIA that were involved with LSD. And there's like weekly reports of the project committee. What they would get together and share information, et cetera, even though there was some rivalry between these units. And this one document was astonishing because it said that they agreed that the LSD should be given to all male trainee volunteers. That's how they refer to it, all male trainee volunteers, so that they would be familiar with the experience. And they called such operatives enlightened operatives. But not the way we think. Rob, it wasn't the way they thought about it. But Lear, Anyway, so what happens with this is that question whether George Bush took acid. I doubt it. With this one document where they were referring to, you never know though, but you wonder. I hope not. With the project committee, okay, they proposed all male trainee volunteers. Then somebody from the medical office, which was one unit who was doing this, they said, why just all male trainee volunteers? Why not give it to all components of the agency? That's exact quote. And the last comment in the document is, the members of the project committee verbally concurred in this recommendation. So the recommendation that was agreed upon was to give it to all components of the agency, which is, I don't know if it was ever carried out, but I do know that a lot of CIA agents were tripping. And the way this worked was it started with the technical service staff. Among themselves, they all took the drug because they were trying to figure out how to use it, which makes sense. I wouldn't fault them for that. And then they started dosing each other within the technical service staff without telling them, telling each other in advance. It was very step-by-step, very cautious. It was like, okay, put it in someone's coffee, and then you immediately told them after they had their coffee, you've just gotten it, prepare. Next time, dose them, but don't tell them they've gotten it. But tell them after the effects come on. Oh, we gave it to you. Next time, don't even tell them after the effects come on. And then they start doing this to people outside of technical services, to other people within the CIA. And eventually it leads to the point where the CIA is testing LSD on unwitting American citizens, and this refers to these safe house experiments. This is going. I'm hearing sound from this. I don't think I want to be. Well, maybe. All right. In any case, yes. All right.
I wonder if I can, yes, excellent. I wanted to ask you, in your book, Acid Dreams, you write that Joanna Harcourt Smith was rewarded for sort of busting Timothy Leary, for giving Timothy Leary to the CIA by leading him to Afghanistan. And you say that she was rewarded by a plane ticket from Kabul to Los Angeles, and you name the price of that ticket. So I want to ask you if, at the time you wrote that book, if you had any hard evidence about that, or do you have any evidence at this time about that?
Okay, I'll answer the question, but let me say that if, I want to work it through to the 60s, and that we kind of keep the questions in terms of really, the flow of it, but I will answer what I said there about Joanna Harcourt Smith, who was Leary's partner at the time, was that other people within that scene at the time, among Leary's friends and so on, suspected her. I didn't say she was an agent or that she purposely led Leary, but other people suspected this, and that there were peculiar things about what happened. Because while Leary was ultimately picked up in Afghanistan, and that they went there together, they brought her back as well. She didn't have to pay for her own ticket, even though she was not under arrest. She was not implicated in some wrongdoing. It was Leary who had fled from prison in the United States, who was wanted on outstanding drug charges and so forth. So I wasn't asserting, yes, this for sure happened, but other people were suspicious of her. That's all I would say for the moment. And, what I had, the information I had was based on what was being written about and what other people were saying. So.
Mr. Lee, I am Joanna Harcourt Smith.
Nice to meet you.
And I want to say that you're writing this. Well, I first want to have the dignity to say what people were able to say in the 50s. I am not now, and I have never been a CIA agent. I was a young woman.
I didn't say you were either.
Please
Okay.
allow me the dignity of finishing. I was a young woman in love, and I followed Timothy Leary on his destiny and stuck very close to him and loved him to the best of my ability for all the time he was busted and tortured. And you should know this better than anyone, busted and tortured by the United States Authority, the United States prison system. So I just want to say that I'm not blaming you, but what you wrote has caused me an enormous amount of pain and grief through the years. And I welcome this opportunity to just let you know that it hurt me. It didn't hurt me in who I am, but it hurt me in my heart because it is not true.
I'm sorry if that was the case. And I appreciate your comments, and I would like to talk to you afterwards if we could.
I would love to talk with you.
Can I go back and sort of continue with what we were saying? Would people like to do that? Okay. We're talking about how the CIA was grappling with LSD and what they were trying to come to terms with how to use it. And part of this entailed experimenting with people in unwitting contexts, moving it outside the CIA, outside the Army, outside giving it to people like Frank Olson we talked about earlier, getting to the point where they're testing it on unwitting American citizens. And they were using these safe house experiments with the prostitutes and so forth to do this. This is what's known. That's not the whole story. But eventually the CIA, they did figure out how it could best serve their purposes operationally. And they didn't end up using it as a truth drug in the way they initially thought of, but they kind of got hip to certain things about set and setting without maybe necessarily knowing that's what they were doing. Because they realized that if you manipulate a person's experience while they're under the influence of LSD, they could put a lot of pressure on them, like a third-degree tactic, almost like torture, to get them to disclose information, the idea of threatening to keep them high forever when people didn't even know necessarily they're on a drug, and that people would crack. The documents describe people banging their head on tables and begging for mercy, begging to be taken out of this horrifying condition, So they're putting a lot of pressure on people that way. The U.S. Army was using the drug like that, too. Another way the CIA used LSD operationally was they would use it as a discrediting agent. They would slip it. The idea was they would target an enemy politician, from another country, usually. And the idea was to get LSD into their system somehow, to coat the cigar of Fidel Castro, if that was the case. They tried to get Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt this way. They did target certain politicians in Africa in the early 60s that they didn't like, socialist-leaning politicians. Get them to ingest LSD. If it was Castro, he would give these long speeches, and before, by the time the drug took effect, Castro would be babbling foolishly, and he would make an idiot of himself in front of all his followers. That was the idea, to use it as a discrediting agent. Another way they used it, incidentally, and it actually was used this way, again, on a limited basis. The problem for the CIA, they couldn't always control what happened when they gave it to somebody unwittingly. That was the big problem, because they wanted, again, they're kind of anal, the whole organization, they want the surefire results, and they weren't always getting them. This is what was a liability as far as they're concerned. But they did think that it had some interesting applications in terms of personality assessments, in terms of trying to figure out, when you have a CIA new employee, well, what kind of work are they best suited for? Are they the kind of person that you should send overseas with sensitive missions, a kind of gung-ho cowboy type? Are they best suited for a desk job? Are they best suited as an ally? What should they be doing for the CIA once they get these new employees? And they found that LSD, when you give it to a person, if that person couldn't handle their acid, well, maybe they shouldn't send them overseas, because they were worried, that maybe, in fact, the enemy had it too. So in this way, they would use it to kind of figure out where to place their people within the agency. Question back there.
Two questions. One, do you have any specific information on its use during Allende's government with its cabinet?
Question about Allende in Chile, and whether it was specifically used in Chile. Again, CIA documents generally don't refer to operations. So if it was used operationally, and it was still part of the CIA's medicine chest at the time, when the coup happened in 1973, so I don't know specifically. But right around that period, there was a discussion among Nixon's people using LSD against Nixon's enemies within the United States. One thought was to dose Jack Anderson, the investigative journalist, the columnist who died recently. The idea that if they can dose him with LSD, that would have been, and this was G. Gordon Liddy's idea, who, interestingly, his claim to fame, he got his job with Nixon because he busted Leary at Millbrook. That's how Liddy wrote. So later on, he's using or proposing using LSD. You had a follow-up.
Yeah, because the last few months, I'm from Chile, the last few months of Allende's government, the socialist principles that inspired his election got diluted into party situation. And when the coup happened, there was really no active government. It was a total dissolution.
But how would this relate to LSD? Do you have any information about this, or?
Yeah, I know that it was introduced.
It was used. Oh, I'd like to hear more about this. He was saying that LSD was used by the CIA in Chile in the events leading up to the coup, or in the period before the coup in 1973.
We used it also in psychotherapy and the university, and everybody had access to it.
Uh-huh.
Suddenly, after Allende's election.
Well, that would imply that the CIA was using this in some way because it was available in Chile at the time, you're saying, among the universities, as part of a plot to destabilize the situation there, which, I don't rule out anything with respect to the CIA, but intuitively that doesn't quite grab me, because again, the problem is it's so hard to predict what the impact's going to be. And while there was in the 1960s analysis being done by think tanks linked to the CIA, like the RAND Corporation and others, they were posing questions like, if you gave LSD to a politically active person, what would that do to their political engagement? Would they become less interested in politics? These were the kinds of questions that the CIA think tanks were posing and looking at, which suggests to me, again, a misunderstanding of LSD. By even posing that question, to me says, well, they're off on the wrong tangent. But maybe we'll talk about that at the next panorama. But you have something particularly related to...
A question about MK Ultra.
Okay.
What was the year that was phased out?
MK Ultra was started in '53 and phased out about '63, '64, but it was supplanted by a successor program called MK Search. The same unit, technical service staff, ran MK Search as well. So it just it ran its course, But
Right.
it didn't signify a stoppage of this work at all.
It
just
didn't,
a new
because-
bureaucratic label.
Because my question is regard to your work
Yeah.
about what the CIA were doing in the 60s in parallel to Marx's book, In Search of the Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
When I read that book, and some of the people here may have read that book, it left me with a very strange impression. Because at the end of the book, he seems to say they didn't create the Manchurian Candidate either with LSD or any other method, and so they gave up the whole project. And I wonder if you would agree with that author,
No.
that they have given up, or are they currently doing today, what year are we in now, 2006? Are they currently doing today things that are equivalent to what you have been researching in the 60s and 70s?
To the extent that the question is about what's happening today,
Right.
and whether the CIA is persisting with this kind of work. Again, I can't say this on the basis of documentation because you can't get documents about this stuff, particularly operationally. But given the trajectory of the work, and given the last documents I saw were from about 74, and at that time they referred to a CIA project. It was called Often/Chickwit was the name. And they describe a computer-based program for analyzing drugs given to them by pharmaceutical companies. The CIA had relations with all the big pharmaceutical companies, both in the United States and elsewhere. And the pharmaceuticals would basically say, oh, here's a drug we thought was interesting. It had all these weird side effects. Guess the CIA would kind of be interested in that, And the CIA had a backlog of tens of thousands of drugs they had yet to be able to scrutinize. And that's what their document referred to, tens of, I don't remember the exact, but it was in the area of tens of. So, it cuts off there, the documentation, the sparse documentation that we had. But you could see that they had this momentum. And much of it is really depends on what's happening in psychopharmacology and neuroscience. They're going to be interested in anything that's relevant to controlling and manipulating behavior. That's just part of what they do. And I can't imagine that the CIA just stopped being interested in it. And I think the area they're focusing on is the neurotransmitters and manipulating things like serotonin, endorphins, possibly the endocannabinoid system they would look at to I don't know. I can't say that on the basis of, because for sure it happens, but I think that's informed speculation. It's likely that it would. But question? Okay, yeah.
Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier that you found all these documents, but there was 20 times more documents.
Yeah.
This is sort of a quickie three-parter housekeeping. How do you know there are more documents? Were they ever declassified? And is John Marks still alive?
John Marks is still alive, I believe, although he had some health problems. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area, I believe. I don't know if he's talking about this stuff anymore. How do we know? The CIA informed. We had requests in. I would visit the CIA, on a weekly basis. I was getting documents, and I had to go to a place to actually access the material. So there was one letter that just referred to this, but there was a, invasion of Afghanistan, '79. It was right around this period, and everything just stopped in terms of releases.
So there was evidence that there was more.
Absolute evidence. Yeah, never released. Yeah. Should I pick up on where I went, or do you want to try another question? We can kind of pick up the story. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I have a question back there. He's raising his hand. Yeah.
Can you just give us the facts on Frank Olson's death?
Yeah. I talked about this during the panorama. It was about Frank Olson's death. But in essence, it was said at the time that he had committed suicide after being given LSD surreptitiously. The death happened in 1953, and this was told to his family in the mid-1970s. His son suspected this wasn't right, lobbied to have a new investigation. The body was exhumed. Investigation was done, and they found that through forensics that he had suffered a blow to the head and blows to the body that were not consistent with a fall to the sidewalk from 10 stories, and that those blows had to be given beforehand. And the conclusion on the basis of that, on the part of the forensic investigators, who had no axe to grind, incidentally, was that he was murdered before he went out the window. So what his son feels, and I think it's probably right, is that the CIA wanted to shut him up. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
If LSD or some other
Oh. I don't know if LSD was found. I doubt it, but the question wasn't about, it was known that he was given LSD. That was not a matter of dispute. What was questioned was the circumstances of him going out the window. Did he jump because he was freaked out? He had been given LSD about 10 days earlier. He was still very upset. The drug was no longer in the brain. The drug doesn't stay in a long time in the brain anyway, even when you're on, even when you're high, it passes very quickly through. So anyway, to kind of pick up where we were. Where were we with the CIA? We were talking, the other thing I want to talk about, if I could, a little bit. The contract studies that the CIA was doing, when they would go to outside researchers, they had a lot of questions early on, when they didn't know a lot about the drug, that you could say were legitimate questions to ask. Is there an antidote to LSD? Is there something you could do to make the experience stronger? Is there, what happens if you combine it with other drugs? What happens if you give it to a person many days in a row? These sort of questions. You could say, perhaps, that there are legitimate scientific medical questions that researchers would want to know. Here you have this new drug they're using for research, and we're talking about legitimate doctors and so forth. So the CIA wanted to know those answers. So they would turn to the researchers, the small number of people who were doing this kind of work, and they would begin to fund their research. Sometimes the people getting the money knew they were getting the money from the CIA, and sometimes they felt they were just doing their patriotic duty. They didn't have a problem with that. Others did not know where the money was coming from. It was a mixed bag. So this research is very interesting because, well, some of it's quite horrifying. I referred earlier to the electroshock and the lobotomy. One of the places they were doing some rather dicey experiments was the Lexington Narcotics Hospital in Kentucky, in the United States, which was a place ostensibly where heroin addicts would go when they wanted to shake their habit, when they wanted to become unaddicted. And what the CIA was doing was using these addicts as guinea pigs in their drug experiments through Harris Isbell, a very, very prominent doctor within the health bureaucracy in the United States, who was running the program at Lexington. And Isbell would offer the heroin addicts more heroin if they would volunteer for these strange drug experiments. Kind of word got around, these wacky drugs that they were, and they can get heroin if they would do this. That's how they paid them. So word got out on the street that if the supply got short, check into Lexington and they would give it to you. William S. Burroughs, a novelist, he told me about this. He was actually in Lexington at some point. But, that was the word among junkies. And the experiments that Isbell was involved in, some of the documents refer to giving LSD to people for 77 days straight, increasing the doses constantly because the problem is it's very high threshold tolerance. I'm sure many people here have taken LSD. If you take it one day and you take it the next day, you have to take a lot more for it to get to the same level. You have to keep increasing, just the way it worked. So he would be doing these experiments. Invariably, the guinea pigs were African Americans. And this is just part and parcel of what the CIA was doing. There was a whole series of rather dicey experiments like this. What's interesting is that Isbell later surfaces on these committees that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, formed to advise them on policies with respect to LSD. When they start changing the policies about LSD research, when it was pretty free form in the 1950s, it was not that difficult to get LSD, if you were a psychotherapist or whatever, to do work on this. It became very difficult around 1962-63. The research was limited drastically. And some of the individuals on these small committees, it wasn't just Isbell, there were a couple others that had worked with the CIA wittingly as part of the LSD research in the 1950s, surfaced in the 1960s to give the FDA advice, telling them what to do about their policies with respect to LSD research. And guess what they told them? They said, cut it back. So here you have CIA-connected people saying, cut this research back. And I believe it's because the CIA didn't really need this type of research anymore, because they had already been researching it pretty extensively, and they were moving on to other drugs. So I think that Leary in some ways got a bad rap at Harvard. I'm not here to kind of promote him or detract from Leary, but just to say that I think he was a very convenient scapegoat for what would have happened in all likelihood anyway, because at that point, the spigot was going to be turned off. The other thing here to keep in mind is that early on, in the 1950s, the consensus, the paradigm among researchers was that LSD was a psychotomimetic drug, meaning it was a madness-mimicking drug, that you give it to a normal person and they would become temporarily crazy, and that this was seen as a very useful tool as a result for studying schizophrenia. If you can, in a controlled laboratory setting, make a normal person crazy, then maybe you could find something that to make this artificial crazy person, maybe an antidote or something like that. Maybe something that can cure schizophrenia. That's what the scientists were looking for. Well, this dovetailed very nicely with what the CIA was up to, because they were also interested in LSD as a madness-causing agent, but not to study schizophrenia, but to make people crazy so they can gain an advantage in a cloak and dagger contest to get information or to make them, discredit themselves or whatever it might be. So this psychosis-producing view of LSD became the view that was adopted later on by the FDA and the medical establishment when the brouhaha starts with Leary in the early 60s. You see, at that point, there were two, you might say, to simplify it, the story, two competing paradigms. Because by that time, you might say there was the psychedelic paradigm. A lot of therapists were working with the drug. They saw this as not something that makes people crazy, but that can help cure people's neurosis, and cure people's personal problems, and so forth and so on, that it sped up psychotherapy. Psychedelic literally means mind manifesting. It would make manifest whatever was in the mind, unconscious, conscious, so forth, and that was useful, therefore, for therapy, bringing material, that was sort of the roots of neurotic conflict and so forth. Anyway, when it came, even though the preponderance of evidence was very strongly tilted in favor of the psychedelic paradigm, that this was a more useful and a more accurate, if you will, way of seeing these drugs, the psychotomimetic paradigm, the idea that what these drugs did, pure and simple, was only make people crazy. That's what they were, nothing else. That paradigm, even though there was less scientific basis for it at that point, won out because you had these CIA guys on the committees saying that's what it is, because that's how the CIA viewed it. As a man, these things all came together. So I think, again, I think that Leary in some ways got a bad rap, and he was an easy scapegoat for what happened in the early 60s, for the research being cut out. And we do know, I have a document here that shows the CIA had Leary under surveillance when he was at Harvard. Where is that good document? Here it is. And getting back to the Mary Meyer question, I don't know if the person here, but this document from November 1963, just after Leary has left Harvard, indicates two things: that the CIA had him under surveillance when he was at Harvard, and that they were concerned explicitly, they say in this document, that CIA-linked personnel may have been involved with Leary's experiments. And the phraseology is very interesting. They didn't say CIA agents, they said CIA-linked personnel, meaning someone married to a CIA agent, maybe, meaning someone like Mary Meyer, perhaps. So I don't know really what happened with her, but in terms of her death, it's still unsolved, at least officially. But in terms of the documentation, it's inclusive of the possibility that they were particularly concerned about what Leary was doing with with Mary Meyer and maybe other people linked to the CIA. Anyway, question.
In regards to Project Paperclip, I'm wondering if you found any connection between the scientists that we brought, the U.S. brought over from Germany after World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and if they were able to maintain any cohesion among that group of scientists, and if they were involved with MKUltra, and how did the assimilation process go, bringing them into the American culture?
There's a very good question, actually, about the Project Paperclip, which is a CIA project involving bringing Nazi scientists to the United States after the war. And usually we think of that in terms of the rocket scientists, like Werner von Braun. But he was the most famous one. But the second most influential was Dr. Hubertus Strughold. I wrote about him a little bit in Acid Dreams. He was in charge of some of these really ghastly experiments at Dachau, the concentration camp. And those experiments included experiments with mescaline that the Nazis were doing. And some people involved in these experiments did end up coming to the United States. I mean, Strughold was sort of, he wasn't like hands-on necessarily to all this, but he was in charge of it all. And he becomes the father of space medicine, for NASA. That's how he's known. I mean, very, very influential in the U.S. space program for space medicine. But, you know, these were, I don't want to go into all that stuff at Doc, you know, but injecting people with gasoline and just terrible things. There are several scientists involved in chemical and biological research from Germany in World War II who end up in the United States, excuse me, but mainly they were working with the U.S. Army Chemical Corps at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Not so much with the CIA directly. They were a liaison between the CIA and the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, but that's where several people ended up working. I can't remember their names offhand, but I know for sure that that happened. Question about the Russian side. I talked about it a little bit earlier today, and I was thinking of maybe bringing it up again later on as one of these panoramas.
While you're on it,
Yeah.
can you brief of what happened in the rest of the world? Intergovernmental research?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. What about elsewhere, including Russia? Because there was in Britain experiments going on, the Porton Down, I think it was called. That was a facility for chemical warfare that got some adverse publicity recently. There's been some books about that. There were a liaison between the United States and Britain, clearly in intelligence. I think generally the assessment of the Soviet capabilities in this regard was that they would have been interested, but they were behind the CIA. They weren't. The CIA was always ahead of where the Soviets were on this stuff, except in the area of ESP research, parapsychology. That was the one area the CIA recognized the Soviets were at least equal to, if not head of the CIA. And as part of the MKUltra program, which involved 149, I believe, different projects within that umbrella, 149 different research projects. Some of those included research into parapsychology and ESP. And there were even some stories that the CIA, you know, they would like attend seances to try to contact dead agents. Now, that is something they did only after they started using LSD. The question, the point I want to make about, you know, here's an interesting question. You have all these people taking LSD in the CIA in the early 50s, right? And the obvious question is, well, what did it do to them? You know, I mean, did it have some impact on the work? And I think in an interesting way it did. Because you see the CIA is very one track. They're like in this groove, in a rut. They're just going along. Interrogation, truth drug, that's what they want, you know. Knockout drugs too, but that's a different, interrogation. Then they encounter LSD. And for 18 months, they're like all over the place with it. You know, highs, like, you know, the truth drug, lie drug, you know, they don't know what they're. And it takes them about a year and a half before they kind of harness the thing. And afterwards, there's such a dramatic change, you know, before and after kind of thing, you know. It's sort of almost like they grew their hair long, whatever the equivalent would be for an intelligence service. They didn't really grow their hair long, but I have one document that really illustrates this quite well. This is from the MKUltra program from 1955. So this is after, you know, that period of confusion. And this research took place at the Georgetown Medical Center in Washington, D.C., Georgetown University. And it shows how the CIA started not just looking for interrogation drugs, but they looked for drugs for everything, for, you know, dozens of different things they wanted to do with drugs. And it's as if their spy minds were suddenly expanded, you know, from the one note, you know, track they were on to all of a sudden, you know, that's what seems to have done. It seemed to amplify their whole, you know, kind of craziness they were involved in. So here's this one document, May 5th, 1955, describing one MKUltra subproject of a program that had 149 projects. This is just one document from that one subproject. And it lists 17 different things that they're looking for with drugs, 17 different capabilities they're looking. I'm not going to read all 17, but I'll give you a few examples. Number one, substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. That was LSD, right? Substances which will increase the efficiency of mentation and perception, meaning things that will make you smarter. Materials which will promote the intoxicating effect of alcohol, materials which would inhibit it, you know, okay. Materials which will render the induction of hypnosis easier, so forth. Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Substances which will produce physical disablement, such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. And my favorite one is substances which will produce pure euphoria with no subsequent letdown. It's right here. You know, that was 11. I mean, there's like 6 more. You know, but you get the gist that they're. I mean, they would never have thought of a drug for pure euphoria with no before they took acid. You know, it's so hot that something happened here. The whole thing exploded. So I think when you look at the internal dynamics of the CIA program with LSD, you know, it's significant. It had an impact. It had an impact on what they were doing. It affected their work. It didn't make them all hippies. It didn't make them all believe in peace and love and brotherhood and sisterhood and whatever. Far from it. But it did make them, you might say, more creative with respect to their own work. At least some of them. Anyway, maybe another question?
You said that CIA trained their staff also with LSD.
Yeah.
Do you think the really big shots also tried it out?
The big shots, I don't know how high it got up. Richard Helms, who became chief of the CIA, referred to it as dynamite, LSD. Excuse me? Some CIA agents did have these beatific experiences. They would cry. They would say the crack in the sidewalk is the most beautiful thing they ever see. And their agents would write down hebephrenia, meaning happy schizo. Everything was schizophrenia. You could be a happy schizo or a sad schizo. But see, it was always this framework of taking whatever they had and putting it in this, you know, kind of limited point of view. I don't think I adequately responded to your question about the Soviet Union, but, you know, what I'll talk about a little bit later, I think, depending on the mood of the moment, is the possibility that the KGB was privy to and knew about and permitted Czechoslovakia to make LSD available to sources in the West in fairly large quantities during the 1960s, which raises questions about, you know, what was going on, that all this stuff was coming from Czechoslovakia. Could the Soviets not have known about this? I mean, that seems almost inconceivable. And what the implications would be. Jeff, you had a question.
I wonder if you know anything about the urban legend that Richard Nixon was dosed.
Urban legend about Richard Nixon being dosed. Wasn't the Jefferson, Grace Slick from the Jefferson Airplane going to try to do that or something? Yeah. What? Yeah. Well, you know, that guy was pretty flipped out, Nixon. I couldn't say. It's one of those wonderful little stories, I suppose. Or maybe it's a scary story. I wouldn't want George W. Bush to be high on acid in the White House. I mean, he's just too weird. You know, the idea that you give it to the leaders of the world and it would make them see the light, which was an idea that had some currency back in the 60s, it's understandable how people would think that, given how powerful the drug is. Yeah, but, you know, it doesn't, you know, just like it didn't produce the automatic results the CIA wanted, I don't think it automatically produces spiritual experiences either. It could, but you know, it's not guaranteed there. Yeah, well, you know, so is the button on the nuclear weapon. On this side, you had a question.
This question is chronologically out of whack, but I figure it's such a big topic that you're not going to get to it anyway.
You never know.
I'm interested in Ron Stark and how you perceive his role.
Yeah.
Give an example of what he puts.
You know, there's several people at the conference that knew Stark that I met. And Ron Stark is one of the great characters of the LSD story, and unknown, really, for a long time. He was one of the manufacturers of LSD, probably the biggest source of underground acid by the early 70s in the world. And he is one of these people that kind of has legs in both worlds, the counterculture side and the intelligence side. He became a supplier for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love in the later phases, not right away. And he's a very interesting character. I've got one thing about him here. Let me just pull it. We can use that as a point of reference. Oh, where's my Stark stuff? Oh, here. This is from the Italian newspaper Il Giorno, which is not a left-wing newspaper. I don't have my glasses, but it's from the mid-'70s. Oh, no, from 1981, November. Headline, front page of the paper, Ronald Stark, agente triplo for Gaddafi y Fedayeen e la CIA. Triple agent for Gaddafi, the PLO, and the CIA. Stark was the biggest source of underground acid at one time in the world. And this is not an inaccurate headline, although the Italian press is often given to sensationalism. I mean, it's not just Italy, American press the same, but Stark was this amazing character who spoke many languages, was a high flyer, who was doing so many different things, many different things with drugs, many other different businesses, one of which was to churn out all this black market acid. And he wasn't the nicest guy in the world, from what I gather from people who've told me, but he did indicate to some of his associates that he had contacts with the CIA. I have seen letters on his letterhead from his drug laboratories in Belgium, 1972, written to American embassy personnel in London, dear so-and-so, clearly, first name, clearly had these connections. I doubt if anyone knew all the things he was up to. But he ends up in Italy and he gets busted. He's put in jail. He's brought to trial. This is for drugs, mid-late 70s. He presents himself in court speaking Arabic, saying he's a Palestinian. I've just learned recently that he had married a Palestinian, had a child by her. This is one of many marriages. So, and he ends up being released from jail in Italy after a certain point under the most strange circumstances, where a judge says that Ronald Stark, the evidence shows, has been an agent of the U.S. Secret Services from the 1960s on. Therefore, we cannot keep him in jail. I don't know how to interpret all this. I don't think anybody clearly can say for sure about Stark. My intuitive, I would say this is the minimum. Stark is in a situation where he has befriended very interesting people within the counterculture and the New Left scene in the United States, in France, in Italy, in England. He's, when the Sorbonne revolt is happening in '68 in May, he's there on the streets. In Milan, the hot autumn in Italy, '69, he's there. And wherever something's going on, there's Ronald Stark. And I think what happened is he was very likely an informant for the CIA at some point, where in exchange for providing information about a certain milieu that the CIA was interested in, obviously, the political radicals, they conveniently looked the other way while he was dealing LSD. I don't think this was part of a CIA plot to bring LSD into the counterculture. I think one has to always look at the least volatile explanation that's plausible. And I think it's maybe something else is going on that I don't understand or I'm not privy to. But I think at the very least this is going on, and this is consistent with the pattern that I see of the CIA working with groups. In this case, it was an individual, but working with groups that were involved in drug trafficking, looking the other way because that served the objective of the CIA, not to push drugs first and foremost, but to facilitate a certain foreign policy objective. And I think with Stark, maybe something like that was going on. It's possible. He is an amazing character, really is. I got an email a couple of weeks before this conference for somebody who didn't end up showing up, who was supposed to be a speaker here, who sends me Ronald Stark's email address and says he's still alive. And if anybody could have faked his own death, he allegedly died in San Francisco in December of '84, I believe, it would have been him. And I'm not saying I believe he's alive, and I'm looking at this email address in my email. I'm saying, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to email him? I say, no, I don't really think I want him to know where I am, because I think this is the first book that exposed him, or certainly first book in the United States. But he was a very interesting character, and I think probably from his perspective, this was all a game he was playing, and he was playing everybody off of everybody, that he was never really a CIA agent loyal to the CIA. He was loyal to Ronald Stark, getting off on doing all these things. Incredible ego, and a high flyer like I've never encountered. But it's, a worthwhile question. Way back there. The question was about information about the work with LSD and other psychedelics in Menlo Park, in the Veterans Hospital, which is part of the U.S. Army or U.S. military scene, that Ken Kesey was first turned on at. And Kesey was first turned on through the military, essentially. Not because the military wanted Kesey to go out and be a merry prankster, but that's just what was going on. That was before the research clamped down. I don't know anything more than that what Kesey has said about it. It seems that his story is pretty much on the level. What's interesting in terms of that area, very, very interesting, which I didn't write about because I didn't really know about it at the time. When I wrote Acid Dreams, it's been out 20 years now. In Palo Alto, which is part of that Menlo Park, Palo Alto, Stanford University in Northern California, you had an institute that Captain Al Hubbard, who I mentioned a couple of talks that I've given so far, he had a group of people there that he had trained to give LSD to others. And this is one of the very few places that they were allowed to continue doing the work after the early 1960s. So in the mid-1960s, you had a certain institute in Palo Alto dispensing LSD to a lot of people. And they were giving it to the early pioneers of the cyber community, the whiz kids of the computer scene. And many of these people turned on. And many of them say that they credit LSD in part to helping them facilitate their work, to push the edges of the permissible and possible was how Stuart Brand put it. Stuart Brand was a key player in the psychedelic scene in San Francisco. He organized the Trips Festival in 1966, and he later he put out the Whole Earth catalog, and he was a kind of a rather important person within the whole cyber community that was emerging. So I don't think it's a stretch to say. In fact, there's a book that recently came out about this by John Markoff about this whole phenomenon. I think this is amazing because it really, he made the case, I think, very well that LSD helped to catalyze this emergence of of something that has absolutely transformed the world, global commerce, global communication. So this is one of the small ways that LSD has impacted society. Anyway, we have about 10 more minutes, so how do we best use the time? I want to try people who haven't asked a question yet. So, the question was the role about the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and National Institute of Mental Health. The entire official medical bureaucracy, the federal medical government bureaucracy in the United States, all these organizations, Food and Drug Administration, NIH, et cetera, Department of Agriculture, Department of Public Health Service, they all had liaison with the CIA and their own agendas were ultimately subservient to the CIA's agenda. If the CIA said this, they cracked it, the others would do it. And people like Dr. Harris Isbell, who was a very high-level official within this complex, and there's others like Carl Pfeiffer at Princeton was another one, worked with the CIA wittingly, and then was later an advisor to these drug abuse committees for the FDA that ruled on how LSD should be regulated, whether it should be made illegal or not. Of course, it was. So they were all part, kind of the CIA encompassed their CIA's work. Sort of brought all these agencies in, if only to supply drugs, if they occasionally came across it, to supply information. If there were conferences internationally and an NIH official found out about something from a counterpart in another country, the CIA would want that information. It was, a lot of it was sort of things you'd expect, but again, the entire medical establishment was governed by this, or I should say much of it, or the dominant perception was this was a drug that made you crazy. And that was the CIA's perception. It was not the perception of most scientists that were using the drug by the late 50s, early 60s. And this was very unfortunate, the way it played out. Again, I want to try someone who hasn't had a question yet. Sorry, okay, all right. Whatever, try it. Ask.
With regards to the CIA, yesterday Rick Doblin said that when he works with the DEA on one floor, it's an antagonistic situation. When he goes to another floor, it's more of a cooperative situation. Do you believe in the CIA there is a similar situation involved with that dichotomy of, good guy, bad guy, we care a lot about this or we don't care a lot about that? And the reason I ask that question is that I had a neighbor who was recently passed away. He was Harry Fitzwater. And he was the deputy director of the CIA during the Ronald Reagan administration. And I got to know Harry and his wife very well. And I'm not a CIA apologist by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm just wondering if you have found that to be true in your dealings with the CIA.
Yeah. The CIA is an organization composed of human beings. Did everybody hear that question? Okay. The question is, in dealing with the CIA, are there splits, divisions, where you find that actually some people are pretty decent, they may have a decent take on, maybe even share your perception about psychedelic drugs? In my dealings with the CIA, just what was it like on a human level? I have to say that when I was reading these documents, they gave it to me for free, and ended up, because I befriended this woman who was in the CIA for many years, and she liked the fact that I was there week to week, and I was actually helping her. When the other reporters would come, I would know where the things were. So she, at the end of the day, would go, man, you could just take him. Go ahead, go ahead. So I came in with all these documents, which would have been very difficult for me to afford at the time. I mean, tens of thousands of pages of stuff. So, it would just, we bonded on some level. She would tell me about her husband, alcoholic, da 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 da. I didn't say, well, maybe CIA therapy would help, But, and the interesting thing is, I've done a lot of work researching and writing about the CIA in other contexts, not just with drugs. And I wrote a long piece not too long ago about the CIA and the Muslim extremism, the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly the organization, which I wrote about. The history of the CIA's relationship with the organization that spawned Al-Qaeda, right, the Brotherhood. And I interviewed a lot of CIA agents, or former CIA agents, about this. And two things, well, one thing that really struck me. Every person I interviewed, about a dozen people, was absolutely livid about George Bush and the decision to invade Iraq. They thought it was the stupidest, worst possible thing they could have done. And for the most part, when I was interviewing, I interviewed the guy who was the head of I guess he was very high up in the Defense Intelligence Agency, monitoring Muslim extremists and so forth. I like these guys. I have to say, there's very few things I disagreed with them when I was talking to them. And one guy was preparing Ronald Reagan's daily intelligence briefs, Ray McGovern, who's now a very strong critic of the policy. I talked to these people, and I'm scratching my head. I'm saying, I just talked to this guy for half an hour. A guy who used to be working with the CIA, giving Reagan his intelligence brief, and there's nothing he said that bothered me. I liked everything he said. It was strange, and shows you how things have shifted in the United States, how even worse they got. So yes, you have to take that as a given. I spent a lot of time interviewing neo-Nazis for a book. And if you're going to interview someone like this, you have to find some way of connecting to make them feel comfortable to talk to you. So it's you have to deal with everybody as a human being. There's always some hope, I suppose. But in the main, LSD magnifies, right? So I think it really brought out a sadistic streak in the CIA. That's no question. You didn't have a chance, so.
By your admission, the evidence that you have right now stopped in the 70s, and there's nothing that you're able to get from the CIA about any kind of research into drugs. And the CIA, I guess they're pretty well famous for the idea that they, instead of researching foreign enemies, that they're interested in researching our domestic people. So I'm wondering, how will we know if during the 60s, since there's so much evidence that you were unable to find, that the distribution of LSD to the public was not part of some kind of experiment? Because, as we all know, science is better with a mass experiment than a small one. And it just seems logical to me.
The question is, given the fact that the documentation from the CIA itself is limited and only presents a partial picture of what actually happened, what about the question of the availability of black market LSD in the starting in the mid-60s onward? Is it possible that the CIA was involved or privy to this, phenomenon? What do they think about it? Did they favor it? Is it possible, given what was happening in the country at the time? That, in essence, is your question. Obviously, we have to make this the last question, unfortunately, because I think, are we supposed to end at 1? I believe so. So it's almost 1 o'clock, and it's a good question to end up. This to me was like a koan, a Zen koan. This was a question that I dangled. It was sort of there throughout my research. From a journalistic point of view, I would have loved to crack this big conspiracy. From a person coming from the counterculture and being, very sympathetic to that experience, I'm not sure if that's really what I wanted to find, but I didn't see it. When you again, I've never known a situation where the CIA so much is directly involved in drug trafficking. It's usually they're working with people very closely who are. Maybe those people are on the CIA's payroll at some times. It's on and off. But generally, with heroin, with cocaine to be the case, it doesn't excuse the CIA in any way. They're still culpable of being they're complicit in drugs coming into the country if they're working with the very people that are bringing them into the country and they're not, busting them or something. But for LSD, again, the problem with LSD, if the CIA would, let's speculate, right? The CIA would want this to be spread all around. We know they were engaged in monitoring anti-war activists illegally. We know they were involved in domestic operations in that regard. And we know that they sought to neutralize, or the government wanted to neutralize these movements. That's very explicit. Would they use LSD as a weapon to do that? Well, that implies another question. Well, what impact did LSD have on these movements? Which is something we'll talk about later in the next panorama. But I don't think, I wouldn't say that they had necessarily a negative impact. I think it's a mixed bag, If it's an amplifying agent, it's going to amplify good and bad things, in a person, in a culture. And if they did this, let's assume they did for a moment, then I think they really screwed up, because I don't think that this was of help to the CIA or the U.S. government having LSD associated with rebellious political and cultural trends. If they did that, I think they seriously misunderstood what the drug is, which is a very powerful psychological catalyst. Does that mean we know for sure? You can't prove a negative, but I intuitively, in my gut, I don't think that that's what happened. But I think that the CIA would have always been very interested in what was going on because they'd have to feel guilty on something like, oh my God, what did we do? We were doing all this research for 10 years. And then these young people they must be crazy. What are they doing? Here, this drug makes you crazy. What are these kids doing? They would have to be, and they would also be in a position to advise, and they knew a lot about this drug, more than most others in the government. So it's a very interesting question. I just don't see it in terms of, I wouldn't rule it out because you probably shouldn't rule out things like that. One should have yeah. It must be, but you always have to look at least as a journalist, what are the possible array of explanations for a given phenomenon? People could read Acid Dreams, some have, and say, this proves it, the big LSD conspiracy. It's all there if you want it, If that's what you want, it's like a Rorschach. Maybe it's like Acid, the book, If that's what you think, it'll bring it out. But that's not my conclusion, and that's not what I concluded in the book. But I give enough space for some ambiguity here. These intelligence agencies, by their nature, are secretive, and the things that we don't know. LSD, by its nature, is we should be approaching it with a little bit of humility, and it's an amazing experience, and let it be part of it just amazing that we just don't know. I don't know. If you see what I'm getting at, I honestly don't see it, and I think there's other explanations for what happened. But I do think, in the case of Ronald Stark, the CIA was very close to at least one major drug trafficker in terms of, and he was not only trafficking LSD, by the way, he was trafficking cocaine and other things too. But that doesn't mean that the CIA hatched the plot and found Stark to do it. Stark was doing it. He was useful to them because he was rubbing shoulders with political radicals all over the place, including he was involved with the Brotherhood at the time, Brother of Eternal Love at the time. Leary was sprung from prison by the Weather Underground, which the Brotherhood paid to do it. So, they're dealing with areas that the CIA is very interested in. I don't think the CIA is all that particularly interested whether you and I drop acid and walk in the forest. But they're interested if you and I are plotting to bomb buildings as a protest against the Vietnam War. That they would definitely be interested in, or somebody would be, So it's a matter of really what their priorities are. We have to remember, and again, they're human. They're not omniscient, thankfully. So anyway.